Hi everyone, welcome to React AMA. So I'm waiting for any of the questions you might have when it comes to learning React. Ask your questions on the chat, and in the meantime, I'll try to have the Vite-based application up and running. Maybe it will take me just a while. In the meantime, we'll see. All right, so we've got an example Vite-based React application, and hopefully there'll be some of you who will come to ask a question. Okay, so waiting for some of you folks. This is the React AMA. Mm, hmm. Oh, really? There is something wrong with the chat. The chat is somehow locked. I'll try to see what's going on. Damn. Um, yeah, the live chat seems to be turned off. I'll just take a look at the YouTube one. Hmm. Shit, you prepare stuff, and when you run, there is always something going wrong. That's funny. Um, okay. It seems I can't set up the chat. What the Okay, maybe it's because it's set up for children. Maybe there is something. Let's turn it into not ready for children. Shit, this is so awkward. Okay, so now the chat should be open. Damn, I would never thought that enabling something for children disables the chat. Yeah, anyway, let's see if the chat is open. Okay, so the chat should be open now. Hi, Ilir. Hey. So today I learned that if you make a live chat and you like allow it for children, then the chat window is turned off. Like it's super stupid, but anyway, we've learned something. So Ilir, yeah, feel free to ask anything. Okay, I had problems understanding React context. By the way, I'll just try to learn how to use this StreamYard thing. I had problems understanding React context, where to use it in comparison with Redux, um, and couldn't fit there on my mind. All right, so the nearest equivalent to React context is actually injectors. So an Angular injector, you could think of a local context in React. So when you have a component tree, oh, by the way, maybe I can just draw it for you. When you have a component tree in React, then let's say that this goes like there is a, let's say that the circle is representing a component, whatever. So this is component one, it's child, it's another child, and one more, etc., etc. So just like we have in Angular or in other frameworks, then what you have, what you can think of that React context is whenever you want to reach a service, let's say some kind of utility, some kind of feature, whatever, then this becomes available within a tree, right? So within a subtree. So in Angular, what you would do is basically you could put, let's just put it in the background. So in Angular, what you would do if you wanted to have a service that would be available only in a subtree of your application, you'd basically configure a local provider within a component. So the service would be available not only within this component, but within its entire subtree. So this would be the equivalent of React context. But the thing is, in React, everything is a component. So if you wanted to have, let's say, a global context, the equivalent would be actually putting it on the top level component. So the difference between Angular services, like injector services, and React context is that in Angular, a service could be a mutable object. Like you could put RxJS reactive stuff there, you could put signal-based reactive stuff there, but you could also put just plain old properties that whenever Zone.js figures out that there was a change somewhere in your application, certain components would basically fetch the data from the services if they depend on them. And so you could make the services both reactive and like imperative in Angular. Whereas in React, everything is immutable. So the data, like you can always depend on the things that come from the upside, right? So you can never mutate anything in React, not only within your props or your state, but also any changes that happen in context, they also have to be immutable. So all in all, if this is basically our, well, I can just make it transparent. If this is basically our component tree, then in case of React context, what would technically happen is that you would have one more component. Let's say that this is this one more component, and let's draw it like that. So this would be maybe I'm not sure if it's displayed correctly. So let's just make it slightly more visible. So React context would need to have what is called a context provider. A context provider would also be a component. So in this case, we could have a situation in which basically the context determines the location in which something is available. So both Angular services, they serve both the logic and the state, and React contexts also serve the same state. One thing that is important as well is that um, in Angular, if you have a service, then you basically have a direct reference to the service from a component, and that's it. And in React, since you always get notifications if something changed, you directly subscribe to a context. So it's kind of similar to RxJS in a way that you do subscribe. However, the thing is that whenever the context value changes, like, in Angular, a service doesn't have a value, right? It could have a properties, but that's basically an object. And in a context, there is something that is called value in React. And whenever the value changes, all subscribers are going to be re-rendered. So this would get re-rendered, and this would get re-rendered as well. So Ilir, maybe you would ask some more precise questions at this point. Maybe something about rendering, maybe about context. You asked about like in comparison with Redux. Do you mean that? How does that, like, could you use the two together or any different combination? Okay. Um, okay, so the problem is that Redux claims, just as in all Redux-based architectures, is that it claims that it should be the single source of truth. So, single source of truth. So whenever you've got a change in your application, it should go through Redux. And now, Redux is also a context. So maybe let's make a context slightly different. So let's just make it a diamond shape so that it will be a component, but a slightly different component. So now, this is, let's say, just an ordinary context, like your own context, whatever that is. And it's available in just this area. And there would be one more context. Let's say that this would be Redux itself. And what we would have here, that would be, again, this violet area. And this would be a global context so that the entire application is basically surrounded by the area. So important thing, oh, I was creating context for everything when I understood I can use both. All right, so yeah, you can use both, but the problem is in Redux, like Redux claims it's the single source of truth. So like if you like in NGRX, right? So if all the changes go through Redux, then let's say Redux being the master of all the data and all the state, it could synchronize your state, whatever, like with local storage, or you could pass it through the network in order to, for instance, create a collaborative UI like Google Docs. Or you could, I don't know, make snapshots and do something with those. Or you would like to, I don't know, do some filtering or time traveling, etc., etc. And now the thing is, if you cut away some of the state from Redux and you put it either into component private state, or even you would put that into another context, the thing is, all this synchronization or sending the actions through the wire or time travel, if those things do not go through Redux, but they go through a honorary context, like a custom context, you lose all the so-called benefits of Redux. So like this time traveling thing, thing, or data synchronization. or network synchronization, etc. So you lose all, like, the whole point of using Redux. Like you're kind of losing the whole point. So you could combine Redux with other things, let it be even custom context. But the problem is that the more things you keep outside of Redux, the less your Redux actually makes sense. That's the thing. So if you draw a clear boundary, let's say all the data that come from outside of your application, let's say JSON, HTTP API, whatever that is, that you, let's say, keep in React query, I would definitely recommend you to use that. That would be okay. And all the client state resides in Redux, that would be okay. But if you, let's say, on each page, you make a different choice that something will live in Redux and another thing would live somewhere else, I don't think that would be a very good idea, because um, it would be pretty unclear to know where should you look for something. Moreover, if you keep something in the global context, sorry, in custom context, and something in Redux, you might find a situation in which Redux might depend on the context. Let's say you've got, I know, internationalization settings here, and your client state in Redux. Redux might need to read the value from the context to know what is the internationalization, like the chosen language. What is the language to translate your labels to? And what if the same thing happens, but the other way around? Like your context would depend on, let's say, what languages could you display depends on who is logged in. So the more kind of granular your state management becomes, the more you have to pay attention to the dependencies between them. So in Angular, the equivalent would be services depending on other services. So when creating, cross-cutting concerns, cross-cutting concern context or Redux, like bear in mind that the more of them you have, the more dependencies you might get. And like always try to ask yourself a question like, how clear is it going to be when somebody walks into your project, and like, are those dependencies are going to be clear? But technically, absolutely yes. You could have as many contexts as you want, and have Redux. But again, like keeping things in order would be advisable. By the way, when speaking about the pros and cons, a context is basically a pretty small thing, so I would put it as a plus, and Redux is definitely something pretty bigger solution, but difficult to say whether it's a plus or a minus. Here, it's a way better if you're using not pure Redux. So pure Redux would be very, very bad idea to use now. Make sure that you're using the Redux toolkit. Why? So it's basically almost the same. Like Redux toolkit is a wrapper over Redux that is opinionated, but on the other hand, it basically provides what is called a slice. So the most common scenario where a reducer combined with appropriate actions and the state object, etc., they're basically separate slices for your separate modules. So as long as you do the most standard stuff, you're going to write just half the code to achieve the same thing. So don't use pure Redux. If you can choose, go with Redux Toolkit. I believe that's at redux.js/toolkit, something like this. Not sure if you have seen Redux Toolkit. Not sure if you're still here, but yeah. Not yet. All right. So make sure that you take a look at, like, you're going to like Redux way, way, way more if you give this one a try. Redux Toolkit. So I'll just send the link to the docs. So that's basically very straightforward to use. Yeah, at redux.js/toolkit. So the difference that you do, let's take a look at a quick start over here, is configure a store. So one thing is that you don't have to, write all the boilerplate for configuring the store. You basically just define that configure store, and the dev tools are already there. Some middlewares would be cheaper to configure, etc., etc. And here you don't have to run the function combine reducers, which you would probably have to run with pure Redux. So here you would basically just assign your reducers into certain slices. So let's take a look how this would look like. So that would be basically, let's just scroll slightly down. Reducers, what's next? Now, let's take a tutorials overview. No, that's not the one. Introduction why Redux TypeScript quick start. Where that would be configure store. Oh, yeah, that's the one. So let's say that you've got three modules. One module is posts, another one is comments, and the third one is users. So this is basically your reducer, but again, you don't have to write it on your own because that would be basically like a lot of writing, you know what I mean. So Redux Toolkit is actually very, very, very similar to modern NGRX, but the one not signal-based, but RxJS based. So one of these is going to be what we call a slice. So let's take a look at the slice. Let's scroll down. Over here. Yeah. So this is something that you would write. And actually, I think this is way better than writing your own custom context for these features. So whenever you have things like a theme, like light theme, dark theme, probably there is a library that already does it that provides you a context, so you can just use it. If you have internationalization, again, just pick a library that does it. But if you have business modules, I think you should you should at least give a try to Redux Toolkit. And the main thing that you would be doing here is create a slice. So the slice is going to create a reducer out of this. So this is going to be generated a reducer function, a pure JavaScript function that accepts, a reducer accepts a state and an action and returns a new state. So this is just created for you. And there would be a switch case statement that would include like all of these actions that you determine here. So I hope it resembles NGRX very, very much. And so we've got three actions here: increment action, decrement action, and increment by amount. As you can see, it's fully typed. So here, I mentioned that in React, you can never mutate stuff. And that's true. So what is being used internally over here, because you can see that the object is being mutated. So what is being used here actually is a library that is called immer. And I'll just take a look in TypeScript how that works so that you can basically see what are the types internally. So let's take a look at this one. And right, so import create slice from Redux JS/toolkit. And here we would import the create slice. So now we just need the initial state. We don't know yet what the initial state is going to be. So I'll just copy what the initial state is. Oh, we've got everything here. Cool. So as you can see, the state, you would expect that the state would be basically, I'll just make it full screen. So you might expect that the state would be an object that includes a value of type number. So let's take a look at here. So this is counter state, true, but this is a writable draft. So this is a proxy that wraps an object. And what this proxy is doing, this is the immer .js library. So what it's doing is that Like, of course, Redux Toolkit is providing all of this stuff for you so that you can just enjoy writing mutable JavaScript, and all the pieces that you will mutate, they would be remembered by this writable draft. And when you hit the end of the function, all the things that you tried to mutate, they would be actually applied in an immutable manner. So that you write simple code, which is cool, and you get immutability, which is also cool, I think. Oh, that's the Mac OS yeah, demo in the background. So yeah, you get two benefits. So the cost for this is that it's slightly slower, but again, the fact that it's slower would be an issue if you were executing hundreds of such actions per second. So if you're just, running such action on every click, which is going to be, I don't know, at most one action dispatched per few seconds, like that is absolutely no difference. So it is slower, it is significantly slower, but it I would care about that when I was writing server code. So in front end, like, if something doesn't cost you, 10 nanoseconds, that it will cost you 50 nanoseconds, we're still, speaking about nanoseconds, with just make a big difference, right? So yeah. So Immer is basically baked in here. If you want to know what is Immer, oh, by the way, now I need the address. Immer JS, then take a look at Immer.js GitHub.io. I think you're going to like it a lot. By the way, I think Immer should actually get wider usage in Angular as well, especially that in Signals, it's required to do changes in an immutable fashion. So imagine you have a big object, which includes, an array of objects with nested properties, etc., etc. So you might find yourself in a situation that you need to write pretty awkward code that, write these dot, spreading the objects over and over again. So Immer is basically trying to solve this issue. So that, let's take a look maybe at an example. So installation using produce. Maybe that. Okay, we don't have maybe a very good example, but let's say if this is the base state and you had to change one property over here, what you would need to do in pure JavaScript, that would be, maybe I'll just turn it over here. What you would have to write, I'll just clear that so that becomes simpler. Base state, let's say that we wanted to flip the done true for learn TypeScript. So we would need to do, so we want to have a new array that this object is untouched. This object would be a new one where everything is the same except basically for this one. Oh, maybe it would be even slightly easier if we basically determine this by an ID, not by a string. That would be probably easier to follow. So if we wanted to create a new one, that would be base state map. And now for an item, we would need to check whether the item dot ID is the one that we're looking for. So let's say if this is not the one that we're looking for, then we'll basically push it forward. And if it's not the one, then we need to spread the item. Spread the. As you can see, this is getting nested more and more. So that would be the item. And here we want to switch the done true. So done would be actually item dot done negated. So that would be the thing. So as you can see, you're writing, and this is done false, and the original one is kept safe. So this is something that you need to pay attention to in React, like all over the place, all the time, like no exceptions. If you're doing exceptions and you don't feel like you really know what you're doing, then probably you're doing something wrong and you're going to regret that sooner or later. So you need to pay attention to immutability. So if you don't want, like if you already found yourself that you are doing things like this, then most probably, yeah, take a look at Immer. So what you could do is basically grab Immer, install it into your application and start using it. Or if you already, if you're already thinking about using Redux, forget about all Redux, pick Redux Toolkit, and here, not only you've got the very nice syntax, not syntax, API for creating the slice, all action creators are already wrapped with Immer, as you can see over here. This is not the original object, but this is the writable draft over here. So basically, what Immer would do here is it would remember that the value of the root object, the state reference, was modified. So there would be basically ... object and value would be overwritten. So what Immer is doing is basically it's wrapping objects with a proxy that basically when you have a getter or a setter, when you have a get, it tries to store what are the changes, and once this function is done, then basically all the changes are applied in an immutable fashion. So that's the thing. So going back from Redux Toolkit, yeah, I think this is very cool to use. So one more thing that I think it could be interesting for you is if you take a look at the bridge library that is called React Redux. That's the one. Which you have probably been using anyway. So that's getting started tutorial. Let's take a look at hooks. Use selector. No, like how come? Use selector. React Redux use selector. How come that's not available over here? React Redux JS org hooks. Yeah, never mind. Whatever. So, what is quite a big advantage of Redux compared to custom context or pure context is that a context is not very performant. So you need to performant. You need to like put a lot of effort to make your contexts work pretty fast if they can change a lot or if they have lots of subscribers. So for this reason, one of the, let's say, benefit of using context, if you have, let's say, some data that is used frequently, but changes rarely. So all in all, what you basically want to do with the context is you don't want to do prop drilling. As you can see this arrow over here and this arrow over here, you don't want to do prop drilling because this is going to be expensive in, implementing the thing, and it's going to be expensive in changing whenever you need to change, etc. So what context is, actually, context is not a state management solution, right? It's not state management. This is just an alternative transport. So context is a alternative to prop drilling, right? And now, if you had some state here, because what I want to emphasize is context is not a state management solution. Why? Because if you had this ordinary context over here, where would the state be? Probably that would be a use state or a use reducer one, right? So the state itself would be a use state, right? So the context is not a state management thing. It would be a use state or use reducer or use ref, whatever, based state. So context just allows you to, jump through all of these levels of the tree, I believe. And so this is basically an alternative transport. But the thing is, this is a very good use case for custom context. So data that is used frequently, so by lots of components throughout your application. So, the longer those jumps are, the more you save, the more time, the more effort, the more coding, the more, just development effort, the more you save on basically jumping straight to the source of your data. But the thing is, each context has one value. If you want to have some objects and some functions, you cannot pass two things into a context. You need to wrap them into an object. Now, the object is one reference, and then you push this one reference down to the components. So even if you have multiple things, you still need to squash it into one context solution. So if we take a look at React context example, that's the context legacy one. Let's take a look at react.dev, the new documentation. Oh, yeah. Let's take a look at this one. So this value is the theme. Now, in this case, this is just a string. So this is very simple. But most often, you would have not only the theme that is set, but also you would like to pass what is the setter function or whatever you've got. Yeah, so the thing is, this function would never have any reason to change, right? And but this one could change. And again, if you want to pass the two things immutably, then you would need to wrap them, in an object. So whenever this one changes, the whole object would change. And if the whole object changes, then the value of the provider changes. So who needs to render? All of the subscribers. So if there is a subscriber who only needs to use this function, yeah, context module functions, exactly. Yeah, so if you wanted to, just use this function and some other thing that you were not interested in changed, you'd have to re-render the component anyway. So that's pretty bad. Being able to change the state context that manages. Yeah, so exactly. So you have no such issue with Redux. Why? Because if you have the useSelector function, what the useSelector function is doing is that so yeah, like that is pretty easy to understand, though I hope this is going to be kind of eye-opening is what is going on here. So let's say that we've got this use state example. So here we would have, let's say, the theme object and the set theme, which is basically passed to all the consumers. So this is the state object, right? Whenever theme changes, the object also changes. So the reference is new. So all the subscribers would have to re-render. Now, what is the case with Redux? Redux itself is also a context. But the thing is, what is the value of the Redux context? And the thing is, and this is super, super smart, it's not the state object. It's the store reference. Right? So it's not the state object that changes because it would have, a new reference over and over and over again. So all the consumers of Redux would also get, re-rendered pretty often. And we don't want that. So for this reason, this is not the state, but the store. So how often do you change the store throughout your application? You don't. Because why would you change the store itself? You won't, right? So how often do you re-render your component because of changing the value? Never, because the store remains, consistent throughout the application. So when do you change? When do you render your component? So the use selector one is actually doing the difference here. So your component, the consumer would use the use selector. You would say like what piece of the state is interesting for a component and some potentially functions. So again, what the use selector is doing, it remembers what was the previous value that was the result of the selector and what is the current value that you are running now. It compares whether the old one and the new one is the same. If it is, then nothing happens. But if it turns out that this is different, so if the old doesn't equal new, then what it does is force render. This is kind of hacky, but you don't need to use it. You don't need to understand it, right? But the thing is, remember, whenever any of the pieces of state in your custom context, whenever any of these changes, you need to push a new object every time, right? And this makes false positive. So too many of your components have to change. Why? Because what the value of your context is the state itself, or at least it contains the state. And in Redux, it's not the case. It's the store, which never changes, right? So if the store never changes, the default situation would be that the components would never, render because of Redux, because the store never changes, right? So in order for them to make them render from time to time, basically, this is a magical if that makes use selector and Redux basically, then, like I think it's also the old Redux as well. It makes them very, 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 very performant. What is the, oh, there is Jakub. What is the old and new reference? So we're speaking about the, let's say, a simplified code of what is the use selector function internally. So in use selector, you've got the selector function. So the one that you would say, let's say, for state, give me some state.items dot, I don't know, length. This would be your selector function, whatever. And now the if statement would be put here. This is the question of Jakub. What is the new and the old reference? So the old one would be a use ref. So we're kind of going into some, smaller internal details of how React Redux, the bridge library, is working. So that would be basically, I'm not sure what is the new one here, but that would be the old value ref, right? So if old value ref dot current, so that's basically how you work with refs in React. And the new value would basically be running the selector function. And inside use selector, what you would do is you would first fetch the state. So first, you need to know what is the store, right? So store, as I said before, it's the object that is brought by the context of Redux itself. So that would be used context of Redux context. So what Redux context is holding is the store itself, not the state. And once we've got the store itself, we do store.getState because that's basically an object on the store itself. So we would know what is the current state. And now the new value, like the current value, maybe let's call it, no, not new value, but current value. The current value of the state, current selector value, that would be selector function of the current state, which is kind of obvious, right? And that would be current selector value. So we would have also the alt selector value ref, right? So we would compare alt selector value ref dot current. So this is the old one, and the new one is basically this one. Yep. So now first render. Of course, after this, we would need to make sure that what is current is basically pushed over here, etc., etc. So yeah, this is how it works. So what is the downside of the performance mechanics of context is actually not affecting Redux at all, because the super simple thing is basically not to store the state over here. So there is one more question from Irir. So it seems like we have a combination of context plus use reducer. Yeah, like you could say it this way. So Redux is definitely a combination of context plus something else. But the thing is, you're not Redux is not using use reducer because Redux had reducers many years before React hooks were introduced. So logically, you're right, but implementation wise, it's not the use reducer thing because it's basically writing the whole use the reduction manually. But logically, yeah, you're right. So I would say like one of the biggest advantages of using Redux would be the performance thing, because whatever, like I would say that this is a super huge plus comparing to, yeah, here, that like pure context is really like poor, poor performance, performance wise. One more thing when it comes to proper usage of React Redux itself is that whenever you have use selector, bear in mind that there is one important thing. Let's say that you have an object that includes such state, which is, let's say, I know, books. There would be some book array, and you would have an authors. That would be author array, whatever. And let's say that there is a component which would need to calculate some stuff depending on what are the books, what are the authors, etc. And that would be, let's say, I don't know, most popular books and authors. Let's say that there would be such a component. So what you could do wrong, right, within the component, dear everybody, that would be to use a selector to write const all authors, and that would be use selector like for a given state, give me state dot authors, and for all the books, use selector state dot books. And then once you have one and the other, you would do like get most popular out of, let's say that there is just a function that does all the stuff, that out from all the authors and all the books, you would get the thing. So const some view data over here. So why is that wrong to everybody? Because let's say you have 100 authors over here, and there is, I don't know, 2 or 3 of them that are the most popular. Now, try to think about use selector as something that basically triggers re-renders. So when would a re-render trigger? Let's say we have 100 authors, only 3 of them are popular, and there is one author that is basically added into the array, but it's not at all popular. So it's not going to be included in this eventual result, but it does change the, let's say, the snapshot that you are receiving from the selector, right? So even though it doesn't affect what you actually need, it does affect what you're directly getting from the store. So the thing is, since authors are different because they used to be 100 items and now it's 101 items, since only this part is different, this will trigger a render, but you don't need it. So all in all, what you should do is create as specific selectors as possible. So basically, your selector should produce the most, let's say, the most precise data, the most eventual data, the final data for the view, so that there would be no data processing outside of the selector. So basically, if you have this stuff, this should be included within the selector. And that's absolutely no problem. So this is a very beginner mistake to do. That you first fetch the data from the selector, like raw data, which changes more often than the derivations, right? So what you should do is basically const view data equals, and now use selector and basically provide one big function that would basically do the thing that you need. So that would be, maybe we would not even have to, write this, those curly brackets over here. Return most popular, and that would be state.authors and state.books. And the thing is, dear everybody, if this changes, does it make the hook re-render the component? Not yet. right? Because it's not the end of the calculation. If this changes, does it make the component like does this hook make the component render? Not yet. Now, only when the most final, the eventual result of this function call of the selector changes, only like bear in mind what is being compared over here. This is the result of the selector. So not the ingredients, the result, right? So all in all, your selector should be as precise, like even if you had lots of logic, this is the right thing to do. Put all your data processing logic into the selector because this is going to be performant. So all in all, let's say you've had 100 authors, 3 of them were popular, and you've been adding and removing and adding and removing and adding and removing, but the 3 popular authors are still there, then the function, let's say the function would return the same results. The component that uses the selector doesn't render because the result is the same. So all in all, Redux would run the selector function, but it would not walk into the if statement. It would not make the component to be force rendered. And for this component, all the virtual DOM and this, virtual face and commit face, like there would be no rendering of the component. So this would be like, this is pretty important to bear in mind, especially when you're, starting with the thing. So maybe some more questions arose in the meantime. Right, so let's wait maybe. There is a question. What about the HTTP communication? Right, so sure, sure. It's like this time is for you, not for me. Great. What about HTTP communication? Is it recommended to create something similar to services in Angular in order to do the calls? So, first of all, in React, you don't have any equivalent to what is HTTP client in Angular. Like there is no such module, there is no such injectable, etc. So that's one thing. Another thing is what people go with most often is the native fetch or Axios or any of the equivalents. So like one of these functions would be probably the most popular tool to be used. Now, it strongly depends on your application whether you need to deal with things like race conditions, etc., etc. Like yeah, but mostly like what I've seen in the wild, like almost nobody uses RxJS and React for data fetching because most of the applications basically shoot an HTTP request, which is basically one message. There is one response. So, like, what kind of race conditions would you have? Like, if you have multiple simultaneous, right, requests, and you would have the responses coming in different order, right? That would be a valid use case for RxJS. But mostly, if there is just one request and one response, there is no need for our RxJS. So, like don't reach out for RxJS in a React application because like most often if you just have a standard application that you're just going to get some JSON, display the JSON and basically it, like this probably could be an overhead. By the way, look at Angular tutorial where when it like the most recent Angular tutorial, there is no HTTP client there. There is fetch as far as I remember, right? So like, for simple cases, like you don't need such a thing. So what people do in React actually is most often you just have like fetch books or get books or get authors, etc. And what you're like using here, it would be basically fetch your probably some dynamic link to what the API URL is, and then slash books, whatever. Now you would need to pass what is the, the can't recall what that was. Probably that was something like result. Result.json, probably something like this. Maybe I'm mixing fetch and Axios, but whatever. Like you just copy paste such a function, and here you go. But in the like, if you had to maintain just fetching the data from an external data source and putting it into your application, what I would suggest you to do is not to use Redux for this, because in Redux you would have to have or at least don't use pure Redux or pure Redux toolkit, because you would need to create the actions for this. You would need to create the reducers, etc., etc. And this basically doesn't make sense. So, like the most common scenario that you've got in this case is that some of your components within your application need to use books, whether it's a listing or it's I don't know, details, whatever. They just need books. And the thing is, you want to have the most recent books within your application all the time. So if you fetch recent books, you want to feed your component A, which requires books, but since you already refreshed your books data, you would like other components that also depend on books to also have the most recent data, right? So you'd like to share the most recent data, and you would like to have it, like if it's possible, for free, right? So that you don't need to create context or create Redux store with all the actions and reducers, etc., etc. So you would basically like to say there is a resource that is called books, and some components do depend on that. And whenever, let's say, the books, whenever we consider books to be stale, to be, not fresh anymore, we would like to refresh the books, and everybody that depends on the books just get new books from HTTP. So what is probably the best thing to reach out for is React query. Earlier, you have probably heard me speaking about Angular query. So basically, that's the same thing, but the most, let's say, well-known adapter for React, not for Angular. At least it's not yet that popular in React landscape. So that's basically, just before I walk into this, React, yeah, and we're going to finish in a couple of minutes. So React query is one thing. There is also, if you want to have something that is Redux based, there is something like Redux Toolkit query, and React query and Redux Toolkit query is basically the same thing, though Redux Toolkit query is kind of Redux-based version of what React query is doing. It's kind of your preference what you use. I think like React query is far more popular, and thanks to this, you will have a lot more good practices, recommendations, tutorials, blog posts, etc. So, like, they're both great, but I would say if you were to pick one, probably the more popular would be better in a way that there is just more resources to learn. So you just create one client provider that is available for your entire application. So as you would have a Redux provider, there is also the query client provider. So one globally, and there is nothing more. And this guy is going to hold all the data of books, of authors, etc., etc. And how do components share the data? Because there is basically one client that will share the data across the whole application, and that's it. And what you're going to do is basically to create a use query. So this is the equivalent of the inject query from Angular query. So basically, this is your dependency. So the component that is going to use this query, it means that there is a key. This is your resource name. Like we could call here books or authors. So whatever is this data that you need here. So this is so for this resource, you're fetching the data from this certain URL, and when it's basically fetched here, you have a couple of flags on the query. So whether the query is pending or loading, or if there was an error of the data is already here, etc., etc. So one of the things is basically if you have the data itself, like here you can see is pending, error, and the data. So if the data is like, if you make sure that is pending and error like are excluded, then your data is here. There is also a TypeScript object discriminant union. So as long as you don't check whether is pending is false and error is not here, you're not sure if data is available. Like first you have to exclude the fact of pending or the fact of error. Only then you can access the data, because it could be any of the three states. So you need to make sure that it's not pending, it's not error, and only then you know that the only left, like here, because you return from the function and you return from the function. So the only scenario left is basically the one that you do have the data. And the thing is, you can cut and paste this into a reusable hook. In our case, that would be use books. And now your component doesn't know where do you get the data from, which is super cool, because why would a component know what is the data source? The component, just like with an Angular service, the component should basically say, hey, I need books, and I don't care where do they come from, right? So in Angular, you would basically put, get dear service, book service, give me the books, and I don't care where do you get them from, and this is the same thing. But instead of services, in React, you just have custom hooks. So that would be use books. And you could reuse this same hook within lots of components in your application, whatever they need. And they would use the exact same data source within your application. And whenever React query would decide that the data is too like it's stale, it's too old, etc., if it refreshes the data in the background, it would get refreshed for all the subscribers of this data set. So this is like really, really huge. So what I could recommend to you is consider using Redux, but Redux Toolkit, not old Redux, Redux Toolkit for your client state. If you don't like Redux, you could take a look at Zustand or Jotai libraries. They are very small and very lightweight solutions. If you want something kind of, more well-known, battle-tested, etc., you like, stable things, go on with Redux. Now, I know Zustand is stable, Jotai is stable, etc., but the amount of articles is incomparable, and the collective knowledge of all the community. So this is for client state, but if you want something from the server state, definitely give React Query a try, because this is going to be absolutely awesome. React Query. And if for some reason you don't want to use React Query, bear in mind that there is the Redux equivalent, which is called RTK Query. So either you use one or the other, because they're doing the very same thing. Yeah. So yeah, happy that I could yeah, help you to understand the things about React. Yeah, if there would be a need, we could think about one more of such AMAs. Otherwise, thank you for attending. And yeah, that would be all. So thank you for today, and see you